Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I'm going to be talking about doing something a little bit different today. Still want to talk about disruption, but I want to talk about, especially with everything that's going on right now, about how do you disrupt the system of racial injustice. I've been asked over the past 2 weeks, how do we apply the ideas of disruption, having a disruption mindset to the challenges that we're facing in society today? And I wanted to take this time with this broadcast to talk a little bit about just some of the thinking I've been doing and share some of the conversations I've been having too as well. So just to lay out a little bit, I feel that what we're talking about today is racism. But it's those two types of racism that we can point to. There's the racism that's being practiced and espoused, the prejudice that people have as individuals. And we all know that it's something that we're not born with. We're not born a racist. It's something that you develop over time because of the environment, the experiences that you have, the people you're around, the conversations that you have. And we all have biases. We have biases that we've grown up with and developed over time. And so it's partly to each of us do that work to understand where those biases are, whether they're on the surface and we're aware of them and we hold on to them because this is our view of the world, or they're unconscious biases. I've shared in past broadcasts where I've experienced my unconscious bias coming to the front. I was assuming, for example, that this one person I was in a hotel with was the innkeeper, the housekeeper. And she was actually one of the facilitators for the meeting I was at. And she called me on it. So there are these biases that we often have, and how do we remain open to working on those? But what I want to talk about today is something that you may have heard, which is the system of racism. And when you dig down into this, and what I'm learning, and so many other people are learning now, is that there is a systemic system. There's a process, there are structures, there are things that have been put into place, laws, policies, practices that have been developed into a system that holds racism in place. And it's incredibly difficult to push against that and to break it. And what I wanted to explore today is how do we apply the ideas of disruption and disruption change and impact and innovation that we usually apply to organizations and to products and to business. And how do we apply that to the system, this intractable system, the status quo of what racism is like today? So just to step back a bit, what I define this system as is the status quo. There's the assumption that police are structured the way they are, for good or for bad, that results in police brutality. It's a system that consistently says that you are going to get better health care if you live in certain zip codes, or that you will have access to more financial services or to better education because of these systemic systems that determine, oftentimes through historical precedents, where you live, just by determination of where you have access to these services. But there are also things like we assume that somebody who may not look the same as us has certain attributes, and we assign an entire race that attribute because of the historical precedents. So there are these things that happen in the system that we see, and as we become more aware and have these conversations, do more research, have more conversations to begin and understand what are the systems that are in place, then we can begin to systematically say, how do we break this system? Because this is what disruptors do. We as disruptors go and see something that could be better. We see something that is a status quo, and we say to ourselves, that is not the way things should be. And we are optimists. We believe that there could be a better future. And this is what disruptors do. We imagine that the world could be really different. It could look something like this, that it could be, and we could imagine, and through our research, through our work, through the conversations that we have, we can craft what that future should look. And we can say the status quo can't stay the same. So I just want to talk quickly about what is it that disruptors do so well. So the first one is to understand what that future could look like by looking at the status quo and, frankly, questioning it, saying, why is it this way? Doing the deep work and understanding, why does the world look this way? So how can we actually make it look really different? How could the world look just completely different from this? And so I would encourage you to think about, how could the world look different? So I see some people joining the stream. I would love you to say where you're coming from. I see Osvaldo, thank you very much for joining. Welcome, you're coming in from France. And Carlos, welcome from Mexico. I assume this is going to be a very international audience. This is not just for the US, but we're talking about breaking systems of prejudice and racism, of inequality. These are all things that I think we are very, very interested in. So again, we have Joanne coming from Singapore, Paula from Brazil. Thank you so much for joining. So I would love you to put down where you're coming from, and also what are some of the injustices, the inequities, the things that you think are wrong with the world that you would love to see disrupted. And don't be shy about looking only at small things that in your close in areas. What are the big things that we think we could be doing differently? How do we disrupt the status quo? Because when we start thinking about it, this is what it's going to take. Because we're not going to get there. We're not going to be able to address these inequities in our communities, in our societies, in our organizations even, if we take an incremental approach, where we talk about a safe way to inch our way to be comfortable with addressing these inequities. It's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. We're going to have really difficult conversations if we're going to be able to figure out what's wrong with our status quo today and be able to move into the future of what we want to create. And we have to be able to create that together. So I'm going to talk about the three things that I've written about in my book, because I think they really do apply. The first one is, how do we think about the future? How do we craft what that future looks like? And then what are the things we have to do systematically and intentionally today to make that future come true? And this is where I think we have to play big, dream big. We have to understand how that system works and to start breaking down each of those elements. And then the second thing is to create a movement. It's a leadership issue. What we do as leaders, as disruptive leaders, is we set what that big North Star is going to be. We say, this is where we want to go. And then we recruit all these other people, everybody else, and we inspire them, and we enable them, empower them, give them the ability to be able to go and make that happen too as well. And this is something that we can do even in our own organizations. Have a look at your diversity numbers. Look at your practices of how you're hiring. How are we actually promoting people? Do our numbers show that we're being equitable and really saying, how do we have equity? Taking into account the fact that people are coming from different backgrounds, have different experiences, be able to help each person be the best that it can be to reach that potential. So I think about that second point. The first point is to imagine what that future looks like, be really clear about what that future could be. Then the second thing is you've got to be able to create a movement around that future, to be able to recruit the people to this cause, because it is going to be an incredibly difficult journey. You cannot do this on your own, and you need to be able to keep people absolutely motivated to be able to move this forward. One of the things I have a lot of experience in doing is helping organizations through transformations, like digital transformations. And the ones who do really well are the ones who have a clear aspirational ambition, so that when the bad days come, and they inevitably will, you will be able to go back to that strong sense of purpose, that vision of the future, and say, this is what we're fighting for. This is why we're doing this. So the last area is to create a culture around this, to create within the group of people you're working with a really strong culture that thrives with disruption. And what I mean by that is, what are the beliefs you're going to have put in place, the practices, your own system to disrupt the system? Because when you have a functioning area that actually becomes this self-perpetuating machine that reinforces with its own practices how we're going to get there, you're organizing, basically. I have talked to and worked with a lot of disruptive leaders and disruptive organizations. And the one thing I found that was a little bit counterintuitive, but actually very counterintuitive, is that they are really well-run organizations. They have a lot of process. They have very strong beliefs. They have really strong rituals that cement what those values are. And what I found was that there are three beliefs and practices that were common across all of these organizations. The first one is openness, that there is a transparency that creates accountability. And if we're going to create a lot of disruption and move super fast to make this happen, we have to concentrate and make sure that we're communicating, that there is tremendous openness, that there is nothing being left unsaid. And this is going to be incredibly difficult to do when we're dealing with such difficult topics like racism, prejudice, inequity. So these are things that we have to start getting comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. The second belief after openness is agency. And I've seen some comments here about how important it is for people to feel like they own part of this process. So if you try to control it, if you try to make things happen from a centralized point of view, this is not going to work because people will start drifting away. One of the biggest and most interesting parts about Black Lives Matter as an organization is that it's incredibly decentralized. And they did that by design. They did this by design because they realized this has to be a movement, and movements are not controlled, they are inspired. And the third belief after openness and agency, it is a bias for action. We're not looking for perfection here. We're looking for momentum moving forward. And right now we are in this interesting time where it's great to be learning, to be understanding, but we are moving now into a time where we need to start taking actions and very concrete actions about how we're going to address all of these issues that we have pressing ahead of us. So I want to take a moment from stopping talking and look at some of these comments. It is just raging in here in terms of these comments coming from people. So I'm going to scroll up and see a few things in here. Again, put in here where you're coming from, and also what are some of the things that you would like to see changed about the status quo. And very, very particularly, what are some of the system things that are happening that you think should be addressed, that you want to be fighting for, that you want to commit yourself, your organization, your team to be able to help address that. So I'm seeing Craig, hello, welcome. Tanya coming from Virginia, Ahmed from Canada, Allison from Texas, thank you so much for joining. Jess from Minneapolis, all heart to you. You're going through so much in that city there. Lindsay in Atlanta. There's some great information coming in from other people. I see Vanessa coming from New York City, Sonia in Georgia, and Francis in New York. So I'm going to keep trying to say hello to more and more people here. And I also want to say from some people here, let's see, we have somebody coming in from Virginia, LinkedIn user. Yes, this is what disruptors do. Oh, I know who this is. This is Lisa. Hi, how are you doing, Lisa? Because I know this idea is how do you not just read articles, but how do you actually, a 4-week series of Returning to Humanity, how do you read articles from people who you disagree with? How do you have conversations with people when you don't even know there's a relationship between what you're reading about and how it's going to apply to your business? One of the questions I got from a leader I talked to this week, and thank you for this, is how do you think about a different bottom line? This is no longer about just working towards the profit bottom line. We're going to think about the people bottom line, the people you're working with, the people you're serving. But also, how do we think about the world, our communities, our planet, our society? Because if you're not having this balanced scorecard, thinking about all the various stakeholders and thinking only about profit, this is not going to be sustainable. And I think we're realizing now that if we don't take care of all of these aspects, then we're not truly living and approaching this as humans, as people. I love Craig mentioning that these are, and again, reinforcing that these are going to be very blunt, very difficult conversations. I have been struck by how so many people have just become very silent, almost mute, really understanding for the first time in many ways their whiteness and their white privilege, or whatever privilege it is that you have, and feeling tremendous guilt and shame about this. And it's it's overwhelming sometimes when you finally understand the weight of what the problem is. And that's great. And I am appreciative myself also of going through that journey and discovery. But we also need to now move into the places where we have these conversations. And it can be really hard, especially as leaders, because we feel like as leaders, we need to show up in conversations and have the answer. No one has the answer at this point. No one does. And I think the best thing that we can do as leaders is to hold that space, to have the place where we make it more safe, that we can start with ourselves to have these difficult conversations. I love what Louise is saying about making sure that we have these conversations with our children, with our families as early as possible, and to reinforce this. There are a lot of great resources about how to do this. That one of the best examples I've heard is that you take them around and you show them as many different things about the multicultural aspects of our rich lives today, exposing them to these kinds of experiences, but also having those conversations. Just going on to a little bit further down. The question I am also getting is, coming from some people is, how is it possible that people aren't saying this? That why aren't we further along? How are we remaining deaf to this? And I think, again, we have these sort of escalating moments and then declines, escalating moments and decline. And it's so present right now when we see a horrifying video, or we hear about an unfair death, or we see something really close to us and impacts us and we feel very strongly. But then, frankly, other things pop up and we get distracted and we go back to the usual, the status quo. I think things are a little bit different this time. I think they're significantly different, that people are coming to an awakening that we can't go back to a normal. And this is why I think it's so important that we as disruptors, the people who are listening to this, are at the forefront of making sure that we do not go back to the normal. We don't go back to the status quo. And instead, that we are making this part of our everyday. So what I want to just close out by talking a little bit about how to be an anti-racist. And I'm going to put out here a really great resource here that I have found called Talking About Race from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And I put the URL in here too as well. It's about being anti-racist. It's just a full bunch of resources that you can read, share with people, because saying that you're not a racist isn't enough. Because anybody you've ever met, ever seen who says racist things will always say, I'm not racist, and they go on to say something very racist. It's not enough to just say you're not racist. You have to be anti-racist. And anti-racist is the understanding that there is racism built into our system. And in order to change that, we have to be fighting that every single day and never go away from that. And to be aware that every single possible time when racism appears in front of us, that we're taking action to try to address that. And I love the work that Tima Okan has been doing around white supremacy culture and the change work that people have to do. And this is for people who are white, but also people of color. And she breaks it down into 6 R's. I'm going to go through them very quickly because I think the last 3 are the most important. The first 3 are to read and educate, to reflect, and to remember that there are times we may forget that racism is happening, but then we have to remember again to bring ourselves back to understand racism is all around us. So reading, reflecting, and remembering. But then the next R is to take risks, to challenge racism when we see it, to understand that at certain times that there will be rejection. And this is where I think many leaders are right now. We're afraid that we're going to be rejected. We're going to say the wrong things. So we'd rather not say anything because it's not safe. We are not resilient enough to be able to take that rejection. And I think this is such an important thing for us as leaders, disruptive leaders, to understand. At certain points, we're going to step in it. We're going to mess up. We're going to say the wrong thing. We're going to show up in the wrong way. We're going to be perpetuating stereotypes or prejudices unintentionally because we know that's not in our hearts. And then at that point, we may be rejected, we may be pushed back, we may be told you're wrong. And we have to be prepared for that. And we have to learn, understand, listen, and accept that rejection, and then come back. And the last R is to build relationships. Build relationships with as many people as possible so we can foster and have these conversations. So I think this idea of how do we become anti-racist is a core part of becoming a disruptor. And one of the questions I'm hearing from some people, and I just have some great questions. It's great seeing you, Luca, around this, that we've had to really start changing these cultures in very legitimate ways, and that these can't be the exceptions, they rather than the norm. And Bill, you ask a really great question. How do we have these difficult conversations, especially when we have cancel culture? This is where I think that relationship building is so important. If people are going to cancel you, I kind of think of them as trolls. Let them cancel you. But I think for you to have this point, it's just keep coming back, and know that your intention is to build those relationships. If we build those relationships, we know our best relationships and people we have who really have built trust. We can make mistakes. We can fall on our faces. We can make these horrifically and do things that are really bad. But because we have that trust in the relationship, we will be forgiven and we can go forward. There are some great resources. I think I've been looking at how to have nonviolent confrontations and conversations. There's a great one, I think it's called Critical Conversations, and another one, The Speed of Trust, that I'm leaning into. Some great resources, which I will probably, it's actually next Monday's conversation, Bill, about how are we going to have these difficult conversations? How do we begin to have them? We have a lot of training and resources available out there, but we as leaders are not necessarily comfortable doing this. Lindsay has a great point here. Let me try to find it. I just lost it. There's so many comments here. They're great about how do we have these difficult conversations, and I can't find it now. I know it's here someplace. I'm going to come back to it when I find it. So Cammie, so great to see you here. You have some great points here about anti-racism for small and large businesses. Name racism, understand it, give it a name. Engage in anti-racism education for yourself and your team. 3, commit to open conflict and allowing that discomfort. My stomach is churning just thinking about that. Invest a portion of your budget to Black communities in hiring. Create value statements for your company that outlines commitment to diversity, inclusion, equity, and anti-racism. I think those are all great things. I also feel like right now, if you are active and anti-racism in your organization, in your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, this is the time to ask for the moon. This is the time when you can ask that the DEI, all of these topics be inked into the agendas of your board meetings so that they're holding the executive team accountable for this and never leaves the agenda. You can ask that compensation for your top executives are tied to very specific goals. But this is the time to ask for those things so that people cannot go away. They cannot disappear. Let's see. Here's another comment here. I think just going through here. Give me a second here. Luis has a really good point here in that we need to discuss what our values are, right and wrong, and how do we ensure that these things are ingrained in our systems, in our corporate policies. And I still believe that. And but one thing I really struggle with is I'm sitting here pushing for my political leaders, my government leaders, the people in policy positions to be able to make those changes. And that is a great effort. But I also want to begin to think about how do I do that in my own organization? How do I do that in my own community, in the places where I am? And how do I inspire other people around me to take individual action around this too as well? I've been donating like crazy. I've been signing petitions and sending out letters. Those feel good. I don't feel great about that because I want to have my fingers in the mess, trying to make this world better. Because again, that's what we as disruptors do. We're impatient and we're not going to stand for this taking forever. Um, let's see. I think those are most of the issues that I want to go through. I want to encourage you, and this is again a really hard place to be. I had, as a woman, as a person of color, I have definitely seen prejudice. I've experienced it. Nothing close to my Black brothers and sisters that are out there, and having seeing just the tremendous pain that's happening right there has really energized me even more to make sure to give myself the courage to go and have these conversations, to check in and to learn and to understand and then to advocate and be an ally for them. The biggest thing we can do right now is to amplify their voices, to start taking actions in the places where we have influence. And we recognize that we have such tremendous privilege, no matter where we are, to be able to use our voices to make this change happen. So I want to thank you for watching, for coming on to this broadcast. And I wish you the courage and the confidence to enter into this space, to be the disruptor, to go and disrupt the systems that are holding inequity and racism and prejudice in place. Thank you so much. Good luck. And hopefully we'll continue the conversation again very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.